You're listening to the St John's Diamond Creek podcast. This episode presented by Senior Minister Tim Johnson.
in charge here? I want to speak to the manager. Get them now. The red-faced customer looked like they were about to explode, and the poor person on the service desk looked like they just wanted to sink into the floor. Perhaps you've witnessed a scene like that at a store or at the airport. Maybe you've been the poor person on the receiving end of this sort of tirade. Maybe even you've been the red-faced customer, so frustrated by a perceived injustice or lack of service that you've sought to go up the chain to speak to the boss. Well, it does make sense to want to speak to the person who has the authority, to the person who can actually make a difference and change the current unjust or inadequate circumstances. Although, to be clear, it's never okay to abuse or threaten someone in an attempt to get access to the boss. Who's in charge is also a question that we as humans ask in our world. Amidst wars and rumours of wars, amidst floods, fires and other climate disasters, amidst personal crises and family tragedies, we would like to know who's in charge in the world. I want to speak to the manager. Well, the Christian answer to the question, who's in charge, is God. God is the ruler of the world. He's in charge. That immediately raises another question. How can you know that? What evidence is there that there is a God, and even if there is, that he's in charge? Make your case, because the evidence that I've just described could be arguments against this conclusion. Well, the Christian answer to the question, how do you know? How do you know that God rules? Is that God reveals this information to us. God isn't silent or absent or disengaged from the world. God tells us what he is like, what we are like, and what the world is like. God tells us about his plans for the world and for his rule over it. Now, these two truths, God rules and God reveals, are a good summary of our passage from Daniel 2. As we saw last week, this Old Testament book traces the story of Daniel and his friends, who are captives and exiles in Babylon under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar. We watch their struggles and their challenges as they try to be faithful to God. Given their plight, they could well have asked the question, who's in charge here? But the book of Daniel intersperses this narrative with strange and powerful dreams and visions, zooming out from the immediate and personal to give glimpses of the broader socio-political, historical, even cosmic events that are taking place. We see both of these things together in Daniel chapter 2, and we can consider them using our two headings of God reveals and God rules. So firstly, God reveals. In verse 1, we zoom in on King Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of the world superpower of the time, military conqueror, supreme leader, and yet we see him in bed, and his mind is troubled by dreams, and he's unable to sleep. It's a stunning reminder that even the most powerful people are still human, are still vulnerable. They still have weaknesses and frailties. And Nebuchadnezzar is so troubled by his dreams that he wants answers. What does it mean? And so in verse 2, he calls in his magicians, his enchanters, his sorcerers, and his astrologers. That's quite a list. It's intended to be comprehensive, to show that what he's doing is gathering all of the best minds that he has for answers. It's the equivalent, I guess, of us bringing in scientists, philosophers, economists, lawyers, and surgeons. Surely they together will have the answers. And he asks them not only to tell him what the dream means, but first they have to tell him what the dream is. Why does he do that? Why does he want them to tell him what the dream was? Well, there's two possibilities, I think. Maybe he can't remember it. You've no doubt had that experience where you have these trippy dreams, but they're so elusive that on waking up you can't quite remember them or get a grip on them. But the second option is that he could be testing the wise men to check whether they're legit. If they can't tell me the dream first, how can I be confident that the interpretation that they give me is correct? Well, whatever the reasons, this request creates a problem for the wise men because the king is asking them to do the impossible. You see, interpretations they could handle. Babylon was renowned for its study of divination, astrology, and the interpretation of dreams. In fact, they developed it into something of a science, really. So here's a picture of a Babylonian dream tablet. And the writing there outlines different phenomena which appear in dreams, followed by the interpretation. And it's believed that these manuals were quite extensive and complex. So you needed experts in the field who could navigate the manuals to give the interpretation. A bit like a lawyer searching through the statutes and the case law to give a legal opinion. So if the king would just tell them the dream, then they could get out their manuals and they could do the rest. An interpretation would be forthcoming. The psychologist Sigmund Freud attempted a similar thing in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. But no, Nebuchadnezzar wants to know the dream first, and that's impossible for them. Verses 10 and 11 sum it up pretty well. There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. See, there's a limit to human knowledge. As amazing as our human understanding has become, we don't know everything. And there are some things that we cannot ever know unless they are revealed to us. I'm thinking right now of a number between 1 and 1 million. Can you guess what it is? Now, you won't be able to find that information using a test tube. And even the best psychologist who studies how my weird and mysterious mind works would still only be guessing. But I can tell you the number. I can reveal it to you, and then you'll know. It's 257,319, by the way. I know if I didn't say that, it would be bugging some of you. And of course, there are deeper questions than that we want revelation for. Does she love me? Will my children be safe? And the deepest of all questions, is there a God? Now, of course, the wise men are not asking any of these philosophical questions at this time. They can't tell the king what his dream is, and so their lives are forfeit. Off with their heads, says Nebuchadnezzar in true Queen of Hearts style. And that then makes it personal for our story, because this capital sentence impacts Daniel and his 3 friends as well. You see, they will be put to death along with all the other wise men. So what are they to do? Well, again, we see Daniel's personal qualities on display. In verse 14, we read that he speaks with wisdom and tact, right? There's no red face blowing up at the injustice here. Daniel has all the soft skills, and they are effective. Despite the king's impatience with the other wise men, he agrees to give Daniel time to come back with the interpretation of the dream. Presumably, too, Daniel has said that he will also tell the king the dream itself. But wisdom and tact won't be enough for Daniel in this situation. He knows that he's at the limit of his skill set. So what does he do? He calls his friends and he urges them to pray. Verse 18. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. And mercifully, God answers their prayers. During the night, Daniel has a vision which reveals the mystery, leading to his outbreaking of praise to God in verses 20 to 23. And really, the key points for us here are in verses 21 and 22. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. You see, whether it's natural or supernatural knowledge, God is the source. He gives wisdom and knowledge to those who seek it through science, history, philosophy, and he reveals deep and hidden things too, telling of what is and what is still to come. God is the revealer. He's the ultimate source of all knowledge. And so Daniel goes into the king and tells him this. He doesn't try to claim credit for himself by knowing the dream and its interpretation, verses 27 and 28. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. See, it's God, not Daniel, who's the one who knows the dream, because he's the one who gave the dream. Now again, there are limits to human knowledge, and there are things that we cannot discern even using our best human learning. If God exists, and if God is the creator of the universe, who stands outside the universe itself, neither bound by it or contained within it, then you can never know God unless he reveals himself. Now, fortunately, he has done that, and he can be known. The Bible says that when we look at the world that God has made, we see his invisible qualities reflected there. His eternal power, his divine nature are on display amidst the magnificence of the world. And that means all of us are without excuse for denying God's existence and for rejecting him, though many of us do. But God doesn't stop there. God reveals himself most fully in the person of Jesus Christ. John 1:18 says, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Jesus is the truest revelation of God. If you doubt whether there is a God, look at Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. You see, there are many things that God doesn't reveal to us. We don't know everything about God. There are hidden mysteries in the depth of his being that we'll never comprehend, and indeed, we don't have the capacity to fully understand them anyway. He is God after all. But that doesn't mean that we know nothing about God either. We know what he's revealed to us in Jesus and through his word, the Bible. And that is enough. Hebrews 1:1-2 says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son." Sometimes God also reveals other hidden mysteries through dreams or visions, like he did here with Daniel. But that is rarer, and it's not guaranteed to us. But God has revealed to us everything that we do need to know him, to relate to him. He's revealed everything that we need for life and for godliness, and he's revealed everything that we need to safely navigate the future as well. There are many phrases in the Bible which are used to describe God, and you can include in that list the beautiful phrase in Daniel 2:29. God is the revealer of mysteries. But what is the mystery that God here reveals? In short, using that phrase from the beginning, it's that God rules. Daniel describes the king's dream to him. He dreamt of a statue with a gold head, with silver chest and arms, a bronze belly and thighs, and iron legs, with feet made of a mixture of iron and clay. And then a rock is cut out, but not by human hands, and this rock comes like a bowling ball and topples the statue. No, more than topples it, it shatters it, and all that's left is dust that can be blown away in the wind. But the rock remains, and the rock grows, and it becomes a huge mountain filling the whole earth. Whoa, what a wild dream. I knew I shouldn't have eaten that kebab so late last night. But what does it mean? Well, Daniel explains that each layer of the statue represents a different kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar is the gold head, and subsequent kingdoms are inferior to his. It goes gold, silver, bronze, a bit like the Olympic dais. And then last of all, iron with its great strength, which crushes and breaks other kingdoms. Now, these subsequent kingdoms aren't explicitly identified here. And in fact, their existence lay in the future when Daniel is speaking to the king. But in light of subsequent world history, they've traditionally been understood to be Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, as the table on the screen shows. This layout also makes sense of the timing of the establishment of God's kingdom. That during the time of Roman rule and in the person of Jesus Christ, Jesus came announcing that the kingdom of God had come. It had come in him. And yet he didn't establish it through military might or political prowess. He taught and he loved. He healed and he helped, and then he died on a Roman cross, seemingly putting an end to all hopes of this kingdom succeeding. But then he rose from the dead, breaking the weapon of the tyrant and every king before and after Nebuchadnezzar, breaking the power of the grave to hold us in fear and despair, breaking the power of sin, which stands as a barrier to our life with God, breaking the power of evil itself and spiritual powers which would oppose God. But even then, this kingdom didn't look that impressive. A handful of Jesus' followers preaching his resurrection, that's hardly what you'd call a mighty kingdom. A small rock, a small pebble, more like it. And yet, just like the rock in the dream, this kingdom grew and is still growing. Don't be fooled by looking around our secular post-Christian society here in Australia with its shrinking churches. Worldwide, there is incredible growth. It's not the shrinking of Christianity that's happening. It's more about the redistribution of Christianity that's happening to the global south, in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. Even in our own Anglican context, the most common Anglican today is a teenage girl in sub-Saharan Africa. See, the rock continues to grow into a mountain, filling the whole earth. As verse 44 puts it, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. We believe that this is the kingdom that has come in Jesus Christ. That what God revealed through Daniel has been established by Jesus. The kingdom and rule that God promised in Daniel has been fulfilled in Jesus. Now that still leaves us with a lot of questions, of course. If Jesus has established God's kingdom, why are there so many problems still in the world? Why is there suffering and bloodshed? Why don't all people bow their knees to Jesus? And the answer is the nature of God's kingdom and rule. That in Jesus the kingdom has been established, but it has not been fully completed. And we often refer to this as the now, but not yet. Right? God's kingdom is here now. It has come through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. As a result of that, forgiveness is offered now. God's Spirit has been given now to empower people to live for Him. But God's kingdom is also not yet. To God in His grace is still giving people time to submit themselves to the King, Jesus. And so God's judgment on sin and on injustice and on evil is being held back. It has not yet come. And the fullness of God's kingdom will only come at the return of Jesus. And that means that we need to live our lives in faith and in hope. Not blindly, because we have the revelation of God to us in Jesus. But also not despairingly, because we know that God has established His kingdom in Jesus. God reveals and God rules. Daniel chapter 2 finishes with Nebuchadnezzar giving honour to Daniel and his friends, but more importantly, giving honour to God. Verse 47 sums up well as he recognises that God rules and that God reveals. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. God rules. He is the God of gods, and He is the Lord of kings. And God reveals. He's the revealer of mysteries, and He makes Himself known to us.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Just search for St. John's, Diamond Creek.